days.
Yeah, it really has been, Alex. Always great to be here with you. We're definitely in a historic time, not only for Israel, but I think actually for the entire world. Of course, the Middle East and the world is at large.
So, this started at 3 in the morning. Everybody in the country forced into the bomb shelters. It was as if the trumpet sounded throughout the entire country. Everybody thought that we were about to get hit by Iranian missiles or Yemen Houthi missiles, but in fact, it was Israel that had launched a surprise attack on Iran. Take me back to the evening between Thursday night and Friday morning. What happened? What did Israel launch?
So what happened was actually, even just from an Air Force perspective, was really unprecedented. 200 fighter jets took off from multiple air bases around the state of Israel and headed east. It looks to me like they flew over Syria, most of them, taking out air defense batteries as they went. And the first wave of attack naturally focused on removing as many surface to air missile batteries that the Iranians had planted all over western Iran and central Iran and in Tehran to try and hamper exactly this kind of attack. The radars, as well as they were already at this phase beginning to take out as many offensive surface to surface missile batteries as well. And so you already saw that this wave was part of a much, much larger operation. And of course, the real goal of this operation was to strike the nuclear sites, the Natanz and Isfahan sites in Iran, and to hamper as much as possible the ballistic missile capabilities of Iran. And I'll explain why I'm putting them in the same sentence. What happened in the prelude to this attack is that Israel's military intelligence directorate placed a strategic warning on the table of the Israeli cabinet, and what it said was, it's not only that the Iranians are pretending to have nuclear negotiations, but are in fact have already made the decision to break through to nuclear weapons. And we're seeing on the ground far more activity than just uranium enrichment. They're already putting together the nuclear warhead, putting together the trigger mechanism, putting together a whole bunch of technical systems that I'm not sure there's much point going into them right now, but it goes way beyond uranium enrichment. It's the next stage. It's breakout activity that was recognized. But also, they recognized here in Israel, the intelligence community, that Iran was planning on building thousands of more ballistic missiles, in fact, 300 a month. And that in itself, just conventionally, represents an existential threat on Israel. Even if you take the nuclear program out of the picture, for Iran to have 15, 20,000 ballistic missiles, as an IDF defense official said earlier today during a briefing that I attended, what we're seeing right now, this is not Iranian retaliation. This is a preview of what they had in store for us here in Israel. So when you put it all together, the nuclear, the ballistic, the programs, the sites, the personnel, these were the main targets as a whole package of these strikes. And so as soon as they took out most of the air defense and as many offensive surface-to-surface ballistic missile sites as they could, the jets began doing things that I think nobody could have predicted that they would do. We're talking about the simultaneous elimination, the decapitation of Iran's military leadership, the commander of the IRGC, the commander of the IRGC's Air Force and his subordinates. And these people are all more important than Qasem Soleimani. These people engineered Iran's entire missile and drone capability. So just to give you a magnitude of what we're talking about, the chief of staff of the Iranian armed forces, at least 9 leading Iranian nuclear scientists, all these people eliminated in their homes, in underground bunkers, all at the same time. It had to be at the same time, otherwise they would start alerting each other. So this was all simultaneous. And then after that, we saw another wave going for Natanz. This is the biggest uranium enrichment site in Iran. And the damage there, according to the initial battle damage assessment of the IDF, is substantial, very substantial. And we saw strikes on Isfahan. Now, Isfahan is a very important nuclear site because that's where intelligence here observed the Iranian nuclear scientists taking uranium that had already been enriched to 60% and bringing it up to 90%. That's military grade level. So that site had to be attacked. We have not yet seen attacks on Fordow, which is the second largest uranium enrichment site. That's near Qom, which for Shiite Muslims is a holy city. And and that really sort of symbolic of this marriage in Iran between the Ayatollahs and the IRGC, and how they operationalize their jihad against the state of Israel by having a nuclear site there. So that site has not yet been attacked, but that may change any minute, Alex. And then we saw further waves. The more air defense systems came down, the more Israel had operational superiority in Iranian skies, until we reached this point where the Israeli Air Force is saying, actually, nothing is stopping us now. And there's just sortie after sortie, wave after wave, as the Iranians began firing their ballistic missiles at us, targeting deliberately our civilian population centers, targeting deliberately city centers. Israel began going after economic dual-use sites, fuel ports at Bandar Abbas. That's a very strategic site. Another one in western Tehran. And we're in the middle. We're in the middle of things as we speak. So this is an unprecedented opening maneuver. I compare it absolutely. It's in the same league as the 1967 opening maneuver by the Israeli Air Force, Operation Moked, which launched the Six-Day War. It's at that level. It's historic. We've seen capabilities here that really nobody thought were possible, and now we're in the middle of this war with Iran.
Sure. Aside from the capabilities, I think there was a feeling among many in Israel, many around the world, that Israel didn't have the fortitude to take on Iran directly. We remember what happened earlier in this war when Iran at the time launched what was the largest ballistic missile attack in the history of warfare by sending over 100 ballistic missiles plus 100 cruise missiles plus drones. And Israel only responded by hitting some of the air defenses, which did open the path towards this attack in some ways, but also was more of a symbolic attack to demonstrate to Iran that Israel could hit with its air force inside Iran. But then also was only a few months later when Israel then sent again what became the largest ballistic missile attack in the history of warfare with 200 missiles. And Israel really didn't respond in full force. So definitely, I think, questions about if Israel had the fortitude, the bravery, the willpower to do it. And so the question is, what changed between then and now? Certainly, there's a new administration in the United States, which seems to have changed the game in terms of perhaps the weapons Israel has to use and also the green light, which Israel may have had, or at least the yellow light to go ahead and to do this. And also, let's talk a little bit about how that doubt may have created the tremendous element of surprise, which made this opening salvo, in reports that I've heard, much more successful even than all the estimates about how successful an attack could be.
Yeah, absolutely. The element of surprise, which was preceded, as you rightly note, by a whole campaign of deception, which was designed to make the Iranians think that there were arguments between Jerusalem and Washington and that there would be no strike soon. This was all part of a calculated deception campaign. I think it's safe to say that now. I would say that what Israel got from the White House was a green light. It's beyond a yellow light. It's a green light. There's a separate question here of will the United States join this war or not. Certainly, Israel would want American.
Let's deal with that later.
Yeah, we'll deal with that later. But in terms of a green light or yellow light, this is a green light in my view. It's way beyond yellow. If Israel had notified, which it did, the United States ahead of time, and the United States was actually part of this deception campaign, I can only call that a green light. And look, I think that the element of surprise was critical for so much of this, because eliminating the heads of the Iranian military, the IRGC, and the nuclear scientific community cannot be done if there's no element of surprise. These people have to be caught out in their routines, and they have to, and the intelligence that goes into this. And by the way, it's important to note that Mossad had a critical role, not just in supplying the Israeli Air Force with lots of its intelligence, but also, according to many, many reports, it's on the ground. And it's carrying out multiple attacks on the ground using precise weaponry that the Mossad smuggled into Iran. So, we're talking about explosive drones, and according to lots of reports, small shoulder-fired missiles that are attacking all kinds of Iranian missile sites. And this is all going on with perfect precision with the Air Force, the Mossad. I mean, it almost beggars belief, Alex. So absolutely, the element of surprise was critical here. I think Israel wanted Iran to think that this was not on the table. that there were disagreements with Washington. And I don't think you can pull off an attack of this magnitude and eliminate the leadership of the enemy's military command structure, as well as the nuclear scientists, without an element of surprise. So that was critical, and the United States was part of that. I think there was a real role here for the United States. If the United States knew about this ahead of time, which it obviously did, that's a green light. That is absolutely a green light, as far as I can tell. So,
Yeah, certainly. I was in the States for several weeks before this attack. And I would say that most of the people that I was talking to in large groups were really worried that there was a major rift between the president of the United States and the prime minister. There's tons of information being published by reporters such as Barak Ravid, always relying on unnamed senior sources. But people really weren't listening to what the president of the United States was actually saying, warning over and over again, that Israel could attack, that it could be soon, and I had to analyze that this was just the president's way of using a credible military threat in order to get Iran closer to a negotiated settlement with some degree of urgency, because we would understand that the Iranians would try to, spread out the negotiation period as long as possible, because that's been their negotiating strategy for decades, actually. But here we see that all those estimates that there was a rift here were all incorrect. A complete disinformation, misinformation game made to lull the Iranians to sleep, even with the potentially with the scheduling of Benjamin Netanyahu's son's wedding, Avner, which was supposed to be tomorrow, which has now been canceled. Perhaps that was also part of the the operation to create a date that people thought that something like this could never happen. Also interesting to note that the president had made a statement that that Iran had 60 days to negotiate, and the president himself saying this was the 61st day. So that was the element of surprise. And I guess we knew that we did catch him by surprise, both because, as you mentioned, the heads of the IRGC and the Iranian military and the nuclear scientists were out about in their regular routines, but also that it took a significant amount of time for the Iranians to begin to mount a counter response. And maybe if we can talk a little bit about what that counter response was early on, what we're seeing now in terms of the waves of strikes, what they're sending, what they're hitting, what they're targeting. Let's try to break down what the Iranian counterattack on Israel's looked like.
Sure. And I agree with you that the amount of time that it took is an indication of the strategic shock and disarray that the Iranian system experienced. And by the way, I think continues to experience right now. Look, in terms of the counter response, it's fairly predictable. And in fact, we've had IDF officials saying that so far, despite the terrible, tragic scenes of wreckage, including right here in my city of Rehovot, just a few kilometers south of here, major impact zone, and we heard the shrapnel of that last night. But when you look at it at a national level, it actually could have been a lot worse, because the Iranians going into this war had an estimated 2,000 missiles. Now, this is an official estimate from the military, but I think it's important to note that not all of those missiles have ranges that would have reached Israel, and we don't have an exact number of how many of those they had going in, but it's at least, I would say probably around 1,000, several hundred up to 1,000 at least. Let's assume that as a maximum estimate. And so the Iranian response, first of all, let's put this in slight context. If it was up to the Iranians, they wouldn't even be leading this response. The leader of the response would have been Hezbollah, right? And Hamas. And in fact, if the Iranians had it their way, we would still be surrounded with the ring of their fire, and we'd be dealing with 100,000 projectiles from every direction, including Iran and Hezbollah and Shiite militias in Syria and Shiite militias in Iraq and the Houthis and Hamas in Gaza. This is what they had intended, and then to go nuclear from that stage. So the fact that we are only dealing with Iran one-on-one is their worst case scenario. This is the last thing that they wanted. The Iranians are always happy for somebody else to fight their wars, to have us bleed on our borders by fighting their proxies. That strategy has collapsed. So now we're on direct state-on-state, military-to-military conflict. And of course, the Iranians are targeting our civilians, and Israel is only targeting military and strategic sites. And the response is ballistic missiles and UAVs. That's what the Iranians have. They don't have anything else. That it's a lot. It's important to point out that this is the largest ballistic missile program in the world by far. That's what Iran had been developing. What they're firing at us, it looks to me, I haven't received official confirmation of this yet, but from my sort of background discussion with multiple sources, they're firing a combination of liquid fuel and solid fuel ballistic missiles. These are all missiles that go up into space and then re-enter the atmosphere, and what they enter what's called the terminal phase, and they come down on pre-coordinated targets in the state of Israel. Now, the Arrow 3 air defense system, which is the lead high-altitude air defense system in the world, in my estimate, it's designed to intercept most of those threats in space before they can even enter the atmosphere. So there are other layers in case the Arrow 3 doesn't intercept. There are other systems. There's the Arrow 2, which operates in the upper atmosphere, and there's David's Sling, which operates one tier down. So if one is missed, quote unquote, there are other opportunities, and we're seeing that. You can see in some of the footage several interceptors trying to go up and hit missiles. Now, we don't have confirmation of this, but it's quite possible that some of the missiles that the Iranians are firing, and also fired, by the way, in 2024, so this isn't new, have the ability, once they enter the Earth's atmosphere, to maneuver. They have small fins, and they can use them. They can use the momentum that they've built in space coming in. They separate from the stage, from the booster stage, so they don't have an engine anymore, but they can still maneuver. I mean, those are harder targets to hit once they enter the atmosphere. But Arrow 3, if it intercepts them in space, that's before they can even maneuver. So I think we're seeing a combination of those, as well as sort of classic ballistic missiles that don't really maneuver much. They just go in and out, on a loop. In terms of percentage, we don't have official interception percentages, but the Iranians have fired hundreds of ballistic missiles. And I think we're dealing so far, as of now, 5:30 p.m. local time on June 15th, we're talking about something like 24, maybe 25 impact sites around the country. So, we can do the math, 25 impact sites out of hundreds of ballistic missiles. Most of them are still being intercepted. The ones that get through are devastating. Each warhead has hundreds of kilograms. So this is a really, this can take out a city block. And we've seen it do that in Rishon, in Tel Aviv, and in other areas. So absolutely the threat is real. But again, I think we should view this as a prelude to what the Iranians were planning to do. Imagine them going into a fight like this with 8,000, 10,000 ballistic missiles. That's an existential threat, even without the nuclear program. And so Israel had no choice, for so many reasons that we've already outlined. It had to act, and it had to act now.
Right, and there's some indication that Israel has succeeded really to hit both the storehouses of ballistic missiles, also the launch capabilities. Some of these are on mobile trucks that they're using to fire ballistic missiles at Israel. Because if we recall, in those two previous ballistic missile strikes in October a year and a half ago, and then in April, that in the first one they sent 100 ballistic missiles simultaneously, and the second one they sent 200 missiles simultaneously. And now we've seen many waves of rockets, but it seems as though in each wave that there are several dozen rockets being fired at one time. Now, obviously, when we talk about the Arrow 3, the Arrow 2, the David Sling, there's a limit to the amount of missiles that can be shot down at any given time. And that's obviously to assume that the systems can be successful even to catch one missile, which in itself is a miraculous kind of technological development. But there is the threat that these systems can be overrun. And that was the fear, that they could just launch hundreds, if not thousands, of missiles simultaneously at Israel, and there would be literally nothing that would allow Israel to fire enough to block these incoming missiles. And I think that there's a question here about how much stockpile of Arrow 3, Arrow 2, David Sling does Israel have, versus how much stockpile the Iranians have of ballistic missiles. And I think that probably there's a situation where both sides don't really want to acknowledge like how much capabilities they actually have, because I think to a certain extent both of them are sort of like very economically weighing, their supplies. And so we really don't know how this is going to play out, just based on the economics of how many missiles versus how many interceptors Israel might have.
Yeah, I think you've identified one of the crucial aspects of this war, and there's no question that the numbers of interceptors. This is always classified information, but I would be optimistic relatively about this angle, because let's assume first of all that the entire all of the decision makers who were involved in planning this attack obviously knew what the Iranians were planning to do, had planned for worst case scenarios. By the way, I think they planned for far larger salvos than what we've experienced. As much as it pains me to say this, because we've already had lives lost and injuries and trauma. So in no way to trivialize that shock and suffering, and it's a war crime because they're targeting civilians. But again, at the national level, my understanding is that the IDF planned for far larger salvos to come in. And so I think it's safe to say that in the planning stages, there was a massive effort to stockpile interceptors, to stockpile just as there was a major effort to stockpile bombs and missiles that the Israeli Air Force is firing at Iranian targets. You have to go into a fight like this assuming that you're going to need a lot of oxygen. Oxygen in the war fighting domain is munitions. It's the ability to have a very large stockpile of both offensive and defensive weapons. So I think that they took all of these scenarios into account. But some of the scenarios that you referred to in your earlier remarks, I think they would start to become very relevant if this attack had not happened. And this is something I'm hearing again and again, and it's getting not very much play, certainly not in international media, but even in other quarters too. The ballistic missile program of Iran was being fast-tracked to mass production. And so if they would be allowed to have done what they wanted to do, which is to triple, quadruple the size of their ballistic missile program, then really no amount of defense would be enough. Then they really would be able to overrun our defenses, and our city centers would become unlivable, Alex. It would become an existential threat even without a nuclear threat hanging over our heads. And so I think that's exactly the scenario that really helped push the cabinet to say, okay, that plus the nuclear breakout. Again, the Iranians, as they were negotiating with the Americans and the IAEA, were literally breaking out to a nuclear weapon, and they had decided to mass produce these missiles and to rebuild Hamas and Hezbollah. These were the triple Iranian decisions. So put it all together, it's perfectly clear that Israel had no choice. And those scenarios of air defenses being overwhelmed would, God forbid, have become relevant if the Iranians had been allowed to proceed as they had planned.
Let's talk a little bit about what you mentioned, the Iranian targets inside Israel. When we recall in the previous ballistic missile rounds, round 1 and round 2, before this operation, especially when they sent 200 ballistic missiles at Israel, it looked as though the overwhelming majority of those missiles were fired at the Nevatim Air Base, which is Israel's primary Air Force base. But it's basically in the desert, and it's in an isolated area. It's not in a population center. And these ballistic missiles are generally believed to be accurate to a range of, from what I've read, approximately 300 meters or 300 or 350 yards or so. And on the one hand, the fact that they can fire missiles from Iran, which is over 1,000 miles away, and hit a target in Israel, up to an accuracy of about 350 yards, is unbelievable. I mean, it's an incredible feat. But on the other hand, if you miss your target by a couple of 100 meters in the desert, you don't really hit too much. But if your target is to fire on a large population center like Tel Aviv, it doesn't really matter if the missile hits 300 meters this way or 300 meters the other way, because it's still hitting in the population center. And we have seen numerous houses, residential buildings been hit, but there's also been some reports, and obviously the military censor in Israel is not revealing exactly where everything has been hit. But for example, there are certain reports, and we saw that Trey Yinks from Fox the other night was running and saying that the defensive headquarters of Israel. The Kiryat compound may have been hit, even though it looks like the building is still there. We also saw that perhaps some reports on social media that some oil production facility or gas production facility near Haifa may have been hit and targeted. And so the question is, can we see that maybe Iran is still trying to target specific strategic targets that may be in civilian areas and just missing? Or are we seeing that they're simply just targeting civilian areas? What have you seen in terms of what they're targeting, what they've hit, and what kind of damage has been caused?
Right. So we'll keep in line with the expectations of our military censor. I think because obviously we want to do everything we can not to give the enemy any information. But within those confines, I think that the Iranians are trying to do both. I think most of their attacks are targeting civilian areas, and that's what I've heard explicitly from IDF officials. And some of their attacks are obviously, as you say, trying to hit strategic areas, military and civilian strategic areas. There's no question that they're trying to do that. Now, the thing is that most of the Iranian missiles are being intercepted. So whether they're accurate or not, they're not hitting. Most of them are not hitting. The ones that do, because it's, we're talking about, again, 20 to 24, 25 impact zones, that's not going to be enough to cause, let's call it, a major strategic shutdown of the country, which is what the Iranians are certainly trying to do. Let's just compare that with what's going on in Iran. Every single munition that is dropped by an Israeli Air Force jet right now, and they're flying, en masse over Tehran, is hitting its target. So that's a very important asymmetry, I think, to keep in mind, especially when we here are under fire. And it might seem a bit odd to think that Israel has such a strong upper hand militarily, but it's not an equal fight in any way, because on our side, every punch that Israel is throwing is landing, literally every single one. Most of the punches that the Iranians are throwing are thankfully not landing. It's very important to keep that in mind. Now, in terms of civilian and accuracy, you're absolutely right. If your goal is central Tel Aviv, for example, it really doesn't matter if it's going to go 10 meters left, 100 meters right. They want to terrorize and murder civilians. That's part of their ideology. They're willing to destroy this country by any means necessary. And some of the Iranian missiles, as you say, do have that level of accuracy, but some don't. And it comes down, if people are interested in this, it comes down to the navigational system that's on board these Iranian missiles. So their first preference is to use satellite navigation. That's obviously going to make them extremely accurate. But I think we can assume that Israel is not going to it's going to try and disrupt linkages between missiles and satellites as much as possible. And so what these missiles have, by the way, Hezbollah projectiles also have this, because Hezbollah's projectiles also came out of Iranian production lines. So they have a secondary backup navigation system. It's called inertial navigation system. This is basically a computer that sits on board the missile or on board the projectile, and it estimates by speed, by how fast and how the altitude. Basically, it estimates where the missile is, and then because it's a missile, it can navigate. This is the difference between a missile and a rocket, right? A missile can maneuver once it's in that terminal phase, so it can make adjustments. But the inertial navigational system is a lot less accurate than the satellite navigation. So we don't really know how accurate every Iranian missile is, but if they're allowed to operate without disruption, they're extremely accurate. If they're disrupted, they're going to be less accurate. And sometimes, they can also be partially knocked off course. They can be partially knocked off course by an explosion of an interceptor. They can still keep going and hit somewhere else. And, this is the kind of chaos that's involved in every kind of war. So it's absolutely...
The Iranians also have been firing drones at Israel.
That's right.
And obviously, drones take much longer. Ballistic missiles maybe take about 12 minutes to reach Israel from Iran, which is unbelievable. The drones can take up to as much as 7 hours, which obviously gives the Air Force a lot of time to intercept them, but also does necessitate that the Air Force is busy intercepting them as opposed to hitting offensive targets or whatever else they would like to be doing in the war. So if Iran's sending 100 of these, this can make jets scramble for many hours as they try to play these cat and mouse games to take out the drones. And what do we know about the drone capabilities?
Right. So that's a very important point. Yeah, they have fired hundreds of unmanned aerial vehicles, as the military people like to call them, UAVs, drones. Now, look, most of the drones that have been intercepted so far have been intercepted by Israeli helicopters rather than fighter jets, which have been directed for missions in Iran and a few in Gaza, too, by the way. We still have airstrikes going on against Hamas in Gaza. Has been totally overshadowed, but very much ongoing, and even against the Houthis in Yemen. But obviously, most are going to Iran. So it's the helicopters, and the Israeli Navy has taken a lead role in intercepting these UAVs. So the helicopters shoot them down. They use their onboard machine guns to shoot them down. They chase them. They've been flying and patrolling all over Israel's skies and along the borders for the past 3 days and simply shooting down dozens of these UAVs. The Israeli Navy has been using its surface-to-air interception systems to shoot down these UAVs. They have missiles that can strike, and it's quite possible, although we don't know for sure yet, but we know that Israel has deployed already a version of its laser interception system along the borders. It's quite possible that some of those have also taken part in the interception of drones. So between the three of those, almost every drone has been intercepted, which is a remarkable feat for Israel's air defenders. And that basically frees up the fighter jets for those offensive capabilities. They're not really involved in the defensive part of things here right now.
Can we talk a little bit about what assistance Israel may have received to shoot down UAVs, also to shoot down ballistic missiles from other countries? The United States has announced publicly that it has participated in the defensive acts of this war, protecting the Israeli home front, but also some reports maybe that the Jordanians had shot down some UAVs or others. What reports do we have about who may have participated in defensive actions on behalf of Israel?
Right. So, the Americans are absolutely taking part in the air defense aspect of this. They have THAAD missile batteries here in Israel, and they've also those are land-based. And there are also ship-based systems called AEGIS, Aegis systems, and they are all taking part in the interception of aerial threats. This is something that the U.S. military has trained to cooperate with Israel. And by the way, this is a pretty complicated thing to do because in order to get different military forces to intercept threats, you need a lot of coordination, right, to prevent accidents and missiles being, fired at the same targets multiple times. So they have to share what they call a sky picture. And when you're talking about different militaries, that's a really advanced thing to be able to do, even within a single military, right? Even within the IDF, for the Navy, the Air Force, the ground forces, to have a common sky picture is not easy and took many years. So between militaries, it's even more complex, but they've been training to do this very intensively, especially through a series of exercises that was held every 2 years called Juniper Cobra. And essentially what that means is that all the data from radars and other sensors comes into command centers, and they know who is allocated to intercepting which threat, even between militaries. That's the U.S. and Israel coordination. And obviously Israel is still intercepting most of these, but certainly the United States has had a hand. Now, we've had international media reports saying that Jordan, based on its declaration that its airspace is not going to be used by Iran, or as they say, not going to be used by anybody to attack anybody else. They're a sovereign country. There have been reports that they have intercepted Iranian drones flying west towards Israel from, over Jordan, sorry. So that seems credible. And it also happened apparently in 2024. And let's remember, there are probably things that we don't necessarily know about, but you have the Abraham Accords, right? The UAE and Bahrain, and basically they're all part of U.S. CENTCOM, right? The Central Command, that's the U.S. military organization that's operational throughout the Middle East and maintains partnerships with all of the countries that are in the Abraham Accords. So I think it's safe to assume that all of these countries are sharing data, sharing information about threats. Perhaps they're, have radars in each other's countries. This is purely speculative on my part. I really don't know. But it wouldn't surprise me if it was true. And certainly the U.S. has assets in all of these countries. So the U.S. is in many ways, it's sort of like the central operator. It's like that 1950s central operator who would connect all the different lines. The U.S. CENTCOM is in many ways, I think, playing that role now and enabling anybody who's threatened by Iran to coordinate, send alerts, and to intercept those threats. This is happening even though the Gulf Sunni countries are keeping a very low profile because I think they're very worried about catching some of those Iranian missile attacks. They really don't want to be targeted. They've been targeted before. They don't want to be targeted again. So any such coordination, if it's happening, and again, I don't know, I'm just assessing or speculating, but if it's happening very, very quietly.
Let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of airstrikes in a country as far away as Iran. I mean, it was always assumed that Israel just could not reach the nuclear facilities and would have problems flying all the way there. The questions about refueling. There were some reports, perhaps, that some of the attack planes that Israel has had been refitted over the last year in order to extend their range so that they wouldn't need to refuel on the way to Iran. But maybe you can talk a little bit about how planes are able to fly from Israel, attack in Iran, basically doing so as if it's they were doing in southern Lebanon, so close to Israel's borders, attacking many targets, and then figuring out how to refuel either on the way back, whether they're stopping in third-party countries or what they might be doing. And then, how do you get these planes refueled and then back out into the sky? What do these rotations look like? Do we have any idea, any indication as to how the Air Force is just physically conducting this kind of operation?
Right. This is something that they've been preparing for years. I think we even talked about it, Alex, at the JNS conference when they declared 2022 to be the year that they prioritize preparing for exactly this kind of mission. And since then, they've updated it again and again. And I recall the former commander of the Air Force, Amiko Nolkin, saying at our panel that this would not be a one-day affair, that this would be a multi-day campaign. So this is obviously something that the Israeli Air Force has been preparing for years and putting together all of the plans and preparations. Now, in terms of what's happening, I think it's absolutely historic because, as you say, when you look at some of the activities by the Israeli Air Force, you could be confused and think, is this Dakhya in Lebanon? Is this Khan Yunis? No, it's Tehran. It's more than 1,500 kilometers away to the east, 1,700 kilometers away. And what we're seeing here is you can always divide targets into two. You have the targets that you prepare to hit, and then you have real-time targets. So the first waves almost always involve the targets that have been pre-planned, right? That was the initial waves. Now what we're seeing is, in addition to hitting pre-planned targets, the Israeli Air Force is gathering intelligence in between these strikes and then acting on it within just a few hours. And for the Israeli Air Force to be able to close the activities in a country that's almost 2,000 kilometers away, and to translate that into almost immediate operational activities, that's the phase that we're in now, is absolutely phenomenal. And that's what enables these strikes to keep going. In terms of logistics, look, the aerial refuelers that are a core aspect of any such attack. This is what enables all of the jets, the F-15s, the F-16s, and let's remember the F-35s. The F-35s are going to be the trailblazers here because they're invisible basically to enemy radar. So I expect them to have had a lead role, at least in the initial waves. But now with Iranian air defenses knocked offline completely, in 2024, the Israeli Air Force took out the S-300s, the S-400s. Now they've taken out a whole bunch of Iranian-made air defense systems. Now, any jet, the F-15s, F-16s, the F-35s, and let's assume long-range drones with attack capabilities are operating freely over Iran. They are gathering intelligence. They are striking. There are other ways as well to gather intelligence. I think we have to assume that Mossad is continuing to gather intelligence on the ground. We know that Israel has spy satellites. We know that there are all kinds of electronic intelligence gathering. So when you put it all together, there's probably vast amounts of intelligence. And in fact, what I can tell you that I heard from an IDF official just a few hours ago during a briefing is that this ability to gather real-time intelligence on what's happening in Iran is actually getting better since this operation began, and now, just a few days, it's actually improved. That's what the IDF is reporting.
And that's obviously critical when it comes to identifying launch points of ballistic missiles. In order to protect the home front, they're identifying where these missiles are being launched from, and then striking those sites just shortly after in order to make sure that they cannot be used for future rounds, which is limiting the amount of launchers and supply chain logistical components that Iran has to be launching these ballistic missiles. What do we know about the airspace that Israel might be using in terms of getting from Israel to Iran? Are all the planes coming back and then going back and forth? And then also, when you mentioned the refueling planes, compared to the number of jets that Israel has, how many refueling planes do you need? How long does it take to refuel a plane? How many planes can be refueled in a single mission? I mean, these are all like a lot of logistics, obviously, that the Air Force is balancing.
Yeah, it's really incredible, when you break it down into that resolution. So look, in terms of number of planes, I think the opening attack, the opening salvo probably saw the largest amount of planes. And once, you take control of the skies of Iran, you need less aircraft because you don't need to worry about surface-to-air threats and those radars. They've already been eliminated. They're not firing. The Iranians are not firing on our pilots. They can't, right? So you don't need as many aircraft because the sky superiority, the air superiority has been established and it's stable. And then from that point on, you can just have shifts of aircraft refueling in the air, refueling on the ground, coming in, conducting their strikes, probably also, looking at what's happening on the ground. And you're having a shift system. By the way, this is not a new trick. One of the things that shocked the air forces of Egypt and Syria in 1967 was the ability, they had miscalculated the Israeli Air Force's ability to work in shifts, constant shifts of landing and taking off, in order to hit so many targets in just 24 hours. So the Israeli Air Force has decades of pioneering, basically maximizing existing assets and turning them into force multipliers through very, very creative logistics and just working them intensively in constant shifts. So the end result is that the Iranians are really struggling to come up for air because every time, every couple of hours, there's a new array of attacks coming down on them very hard. So absolutely, the Israeli Air Force working with the Mossad hand in hand is turning intelligence into accurate firepower, and it's doing it in a massive way, and it's doing it in ways that I think nobody except the people who were in on this could have predicted that would be so sustained, so precise at such a long distance. Definitely, we're seeing military history here in the making.
Now, in terms of your assessment, how far into the campaign is Israel right now? We're still just maybe 72 hours or so into the campaign, but in terms of percentage, how far along in this campaign is Israel? What are the goals here? I mean, and what has to be achieved that hasn't been achieved yet in order for Israel to reach its goals? What do you see in the days ahead?
So I think that Israel will want to continue, first of all, damaging the Iranian nuclear program in the coming days. We still have some sites that have been untouched. And first and foremost, I mentioned Fordow. There's another site called Arak, which is to do with their plutonium, which is a different kind of heavy water. Exactly. That hasn't been touched yet either, as far as I know. But really, Fordow is the main thing that I'm waiting to see what happens with that target. So I would be very surprised if this war ends without some sort of attack on Fordow. Are we waiting for the Americans to come in, or do we have a plan for making that happen later? These are all unknowns. This is obviously totally classified. So I would just put a flag on that site and urge viewers to watch it, because I think I can't imagine this conflict ending with Fordow remaining intact. And if that does happen, I would be surprised and wonder why. So that's one. And also, I would expect more attacks on their missile capabilities, especially. Let's just create a little bit of order with the missiles. There are two kinds of systems that the Iranians use to fire missiles at us. One is from underground missile launchers that the launcher is just sort of coming out of mountain edges. One such site was hit yesterday in western Iran. And amazingly, it's a place where the former IRGC Air Force commander and the former chief of staff of the Iranian armed forces, both of whom were eliminated on June 13th, used to parade through very proudly because they called it an underground missile city, and you had all these ballistic missiles, and you probably remember the propaganda footage, and these were very real sites. So those are being hit. Those bases and launch bases are being hit. And then you have the mobile launchers, what the Air Force it says that it's hunting. And those are the trucks. A lot of them are disguised as civilian trucks, and suddenly the roof comes off and you have a missile that's launched. So those are the two main things that are being targeted. And if you take out launchers, so even if they have missiles, right, but they don't have launchers to fire them with, that creates a massive bottleneck for their ability to attack Israel. So I think there's a lot more, I think, of those targets that Israel wants to hit, set back their missile program and their nuclear program. But I think, there's a third dimension, Alex, and in some ways it's kind of the elephant in the room. And it's to do with the regime itself, right? Because I wrote an article for JNS a couple of weeks ago in which I also interviewed the former commander of CENTCOM, General Retired McKenzie. And one of the things he said is that if it was up to him, he thought that the United States should force Iran to choose, the regime, to choose between the nuclear program and its survival. And the way to do that, he said, was in any attack to make it clear to the Iranians it wouldn't just be the nuclear program, right? Because even the Americans with their bunker busters and their strategic bombers, even them, he said, could only set the program back by many months. As long as the regime exists, the chances are that it could start rebuilding the nuclear program. And that's also true for our attack. The estimate I heard today is that the attacks took back Natanz and Isfahan by many months. So even if it's less than the American, it's the same equation. What we're doing here, as long as the regime exists, we're buying time. But if the regime collapses, if it destabilizes, then we're in a whole new world. Then it's a strategic reset of the entire chessboard. And if that happens, then perhaps somebody more moderate will come to power. We know there are millions of moderate Iranians who love the state of Israel, love the Jewish people, love the United States, are pro-Western, despise their regime and view it as their enemy. I'm sure we've all met those Iranians when traveling abroad. I know I have, and it's incredible to me how supportive they are. I've also seen them at protests and pro-Israel protests in the middle of Western capitals. So that's a very important population. Prime Minister Netanyahu makes sure to talk to these people directly. And we've seen in the past 24 hours, Alex, that the Israeli Air Force has begun to expand its attacks to target the economic foundations, the pillars of this regime. Now, the question is why? Why is this happening? I think the first reason is to signal to the regime, if you continue firing ballistic missiles at our population centers, you face an existential threat to the regime, not to the country of Iran, but to the Islamic Republic, this fanatical jihadist Shiite regime. Because if we start taking out their oil refineries and their ports, and Bandar Abbas was hit, I mentioned at the beginning, and in Western Iran, an oil site was hit, a fuel site. If this continues, this begins to destabilize the regime. And so even if the regime doesn't fall during this war, if the economic damage that is caused is significant enough, perhaps that would create the push, that would create, the domino effect, just like we saw in Syria, by the way, after the Lebanon war, when Assad collapsed because Hezbollah couldn't help him and the Sunni rebels saw that they had their chance. Perhaps these attacks will also help the regime, help the people of Iran bring down their regime. And that's something we have to look out for, because that would actually solve the nuclear crisis rather than just buying time.
Right, it's the chicken and the egg. It's the nuclear program didn't come before the people that built it and the people with their fingers on the button. And the question is, Israel obviously targeting the nuclear scientists, obviously targeting the chief of staff of the Iranian military, the head of the Revolutionary Guards Corps. And why has Israel not chosen or is unable to target the Ayatollah himself, Ali Khamenei, who is the head of the terror snake, and also potentially his sons, and specifically his second son, which has been provisionally appointed as a successor to Khamenei as the supreme leader?
Yeah. So my assumption is that he may be targeted at any moment. He's probably very deep in a bunker somewhere, whisked away to an emergency, facility. which many governments have. But I wouldn't be surprised if he would be targeted, Alex. It wouldn't surprise me at all. We're still not at the end of this war. I think there are many surprises ahead, and he might be targeted. And another thing that I think we have to look out for is that Ayatollah Khamenei, right? He built this entire regime based on the idea that they're going to export the Islamic Revolution. They're going to take over the Middle East. They're going to build terror armies. They're going to build a worldwide caliphate in the end. These are all things that he had promised. And now what the Iranian people see are squadrons of Israeli fighter jets over their skies in Tehran as if it was Gaza. And they see that the Mossad is operating freely in Iran. This is going to severely discredit Ayatollah Khamenei and his stooges, his fundamentalist Ayatollah regime. It's going to make them look extremely weak in the eyes of his people. And that's something that if he survives this war, he's going to have to contend with. So that's another thing I would throw into the mix.
And do you think that the United States will participate at some point before the end of the war, not only in the defensive capacity, but whether that means using its heavy bombers, either the B-2 or the B-52, and the Moab, the mother of all bombs, in order to really sort of blast these underground nuclear facilities like Fordo and Natanz, really right out of the mountain. Things that it might be more difficult for Israel to do, provided, of course, that Israel has already succeeded in taking out all of the air defenses, all the ballistic missile, like as a last strike, that America just comes in and quickly finishes that job once and for all.
Yeah, well, look, I sure hope so. I hope that they do it. Whether they will or not, based on the statements of President Trump and basically the posturing of the White House right now, I would say that it's very much up to the Iranians. So what the U.S. is signaling to the Iranians is, if you attack any of our bases, any of our embassies, any U.S. asset in the Middle East, if any Iranian missiles start heading that way, and many of those thousands of Iranian missiles are short-range missiles designed to hit exactly those targets, then I think the U.S. will come in. So will the Iranians? Yeah.
And we're seeing also, calls from the Americans and others for the Iranians to return to the negotiating table. And it would seem as though it might be a little bit late for negotiation. But do you see Israel ceding to any path where Iranians would enter into negotiations, agree to stop firing ballistic missiles at Israel, where Israel would say, okay, fine, if that's the case, we'll stop our attacks? Or do you see at this point Israel going all the way to the finish, whatever that looks like?
Yeah, I think that the Israeli decision-making is going to be guided first and foremost by how much damage is caused to the Iranian program. I think any statements by Iran are not going to be taken very seriously about future intentions at this stage, because I think even the Iranians themselves are in disarray. So they don't really know what they themselves are going to do, I think, after this war, assuming the regime survives. But if the Iranians choose a diplomatic path, as Trump is offering to them, and they end up, abandoning their nuclear program, which I think is highly unlikely given the nature of this regime and everything we know about it, then of course Israel would welcome that. And if Iran had done that to begin with, then this war wouldn't have happened. Israel never had any opposition to a diplomatic path. It's just that the Iranians had no intention of going down that path, and were actually using it as a cover for breaking out to nuclear weapons. So it all depends on what the intelligence delivers from the field, from the ground, about Iran's activities. I think that's what's going to determine future Israeli actions. At least in the short term, there's no chance, I think, of Iran returning to talks. If anything, before this war, it said repeatedly that if it's attacked, it's going to leave the NPT. That's the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And again, I think that the biggest calculation here, beyond the fanatical ideology of the Ayatollahs and of Khamenei, is also they're going to try and figure out how to save face in front of their own base, their hardline base. If they go back to negotiations after this preemptive strike, I think that they will be looked upon as a disgrace by their own hardline base. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. And I think they're very worried about how they're being perceived by their base in Iran. So that's something that's going to influence their decisions and their rhetoric and their actions going forward.
Okay, any final thoughts?
I would just urge, first of all, those of us who live here in Israel to stay safe, listen to the instructions, obviously, of the Home Front Command, because we're dealing, as we all know by now, with a different magnitude of threat than what we've become used to. And also, to our friends, to our supporters abroad, and everybody who's abroad, I think it's important, that if you discuss these things, it's important to make the case and to be clear that this is a war of no choice. This is nothing to do with attacking because something might happen. This attack was launched because something did happen, and that something was an Iranian sprint to a nuclear weapon and an Iranian sprint to the mass production of ballistic missiles. And we're just getting a taste of what that reality would look like if it went unchecked. So I think it's very important for the world to understand that. And also, perhaps to make it clear that this is not a local regional issue. Iran is part of an international alliance with Russia, with China to a certain degree, and the weapons that the Iranians produce and export to Russia are being fired in Eastern Europe. So if anybody thinks that these conflict zones are local, they don't affect the West, I think they're dead wrong, and they need to understand that this is part of a global confrontation, and Israel's on the front line, and it's pushing back against a jihadist a state that, if it was not checked, would threaten the entire world. So I think the West actually owes a real debt of gratitude to Israel for doing a lot of the so-called dirty work that nobody else seems willing to do.
Yeah, Yaakov, and I think it's also really important for everybody to recognize that this war was launched on Israel on October 7th. It was a war that Israel didn't want to fight. Hamas crossed the border, killed 1,200 people, took over 250 hostage, injured thousands of others. But almost from the first minute after that attack, there were simultaneous attacks from the Houthis in Yemen and from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. We see all these terror proxies of Iran firing on Israel. This war has been going on for 600 days. There's been over tens of thousands of rockets fired from all sides at Israel, and we're continuing even until the attack. And we're still getting regular missiles coming in from Yemen, being fired, which were Iranian missiles being fired by Iran's terror proxy, the Houthis. I think it was assumed by many when Israel was found itself engaged in a multi-front war, that it would start with Gaza and Hamas, it would continue on to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and it would ultimately culminate with the head of this terror octopus, which is Iran. And this is the stage of the war that we're in now. And it is my belief that we are probably less than 2 weeks away from the end of a 600-plus day war that Israel's been attacked on all sides, and it looks like, by all accounts, Israel is going to become the grand victor as if things continue going the way they're going right now.
Yeah, I agree. And this was a war that was thrust on us on October 7th, in many ways long before. But in terms of the attack, of course, we know, by the way, from documents that the Iranians were aware of Hamas's plans to launch the October 7th attack. They had approved a large-scale attack of this nature. Hezbollah was aware of that as well. Documents in Arabic have been released. So there's no question that these enemies were in coordination with one another, and everything that Hamas did to us on that awful day was enabled by Iranian weapons, by Iranian ideology, by Iranian doctrine, training, financing. So there's no question that the Iranian fingerprint was all over October 7th. And, it's worth wondering whether perhaps this was also part of an attempt to distract Israel as the Iranians would rush through to their nuclear weapons phase. It's another thing to keep in mind. But at the end of the day, this is definitely part of one network. And I totally agree with you. The correct order was to eliminate most of the threat in Gaza, to go after Hezbollah, and now to go after Iran. And this is why it was so critical not to stop the war prematurely, as so many had tried to get Israel to do, both externally and unfortunately also internally. Had we stopped this war in the middle, now we would be facing Iran's proxies as well as Iran, and the situation would have been so much worse.
Well, Yaakov, I want to thank you for your deep, intense knowledge and your incredible analysis. And before we wrap up, I just want to let everybody recognize that we are a nonprofit news organization. The work that we do is not free. We've been reporting around the clock, even beyond any capacity we thought we would ever have. Basically since October 7th and all the way through, and working now around the clock to keep up with every update. I urge everybody to make sure you go to jns.org, make it your primary source of news about Israel, about this war, about what's going on in the Jewish world abroad. Sign up to our email newsletter. You can see many, many more videos of ours on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the page, and you can also download our app from the App Store. But also, if you appreciate the work we're doing, if you appreciate Yaakov's analysis and you're a regular consumer of JNS, or you believe that many more people need to be regular consumers of JNS, go to jns.org, click on the donate button, make a contribution, make a meaningful contribution for the meaningful work that we're doing. Thank you guys all for being here today, for participating. And as this war continues to progress, we are likely to bring you with continued updates in this format. So stay tuned to our channel, and everybody, whether you're in Israel, whether you're abroad, stay safe. And God willing, we will be able to celebrate a crushing, conclusive Israeli victory in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.